It started with a foul smell. The tenants of the old Victorian house on Elmridge Street in Detroit had long complained about the plumbing, the roaches, and the flickering lights. But in late August of 2013, something far more sinister began to fester beneath their feet. The stench wafted through the vents, seeping into every room, so putrid and strange that some thought it was a dead animal. Others thought it was mold. No one thought it was human. That is, until maintenance man Greg Doyle decided to investigate. Greg had worked for the landlord, Peter Mallory, for 3 years. He was a quiet man in his 60s with a limp and a soft voice, known for minding his business. But even Greg couldn't ignore the overwhelming odor. One evening, armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, he pried open a floorboard in the corner of apartment 2B. He never forgot what he saw. A pale, bloated hand, frozen in a desperate grasp. Police arrived within the hour. Homicide detectives quickly sealed off the entire building and began excavating the floor beneath 2B. What they found horrified even the most seasoned officers: the remains of not one, but 3 bodies buried in shallow graves beneath the wooden floorboards. Each had been tightly wrapped in tarp and duct tape. Forensics determined they had been dead for months, possibly years. There were signs of blunt force trauma to the head, strangulation marks, and evidence suggesting the bodies had been moved post-mortem. As the investigation began, tenants were evacuated. The house was declared a crime scene. But the biggest shock came when investigators traced ownership of the property. The landlord, Peter Mallory, wasn't just the man who collected the rent. He was the prime suspect in a triple homicide. On the surface, Peter Mallory appeared to be a respectable property owner. He was in his early 50s, clean-cut, polite, and always wore slacks and a tucked-in shirt. He owned 5 rental properties across Detroit and had a reputation for being strict but fair. Rent was always due on the 1st, and if you were late, even by a day, he'd be knocking on your door. But behind closed doors, Peter had a darker reputation. Several former tenants told investigators that Peter was controlling and paranoid. He would show up unannounced, let himself into apartments with his master key, and threaten eviction for the smallest infractions. One woman, Sandra Ruiz, claimed he once screamed at her for having a boyfriend stay the night. "He acted like he owned us, not just the building," she said. "Like we were his property too." But what no one knew at the time was that Peter had a criminal past, one he had carefully hidden. In the 1980s, Peter served 5 years in prison for aggravated assault after attacking a man during a property dispute. The records were sealed after he completed parole. He had no further run-ins with the law, until now. The 3 bodies were eventually identified as Marsha Lee, 29, a single mother who had lived in 2B with her young son until she vanished in late 2010. Her child was later placed in foster care. Deshaun Carter, 42, a disabled man who had been evicted for violating noise policies in 2011. He hadn't been seen since. Rachel Nguyen, 35, a nurse who had just moved in during the summer of 2012. She had reportedly complained about Peter's frequent intrusions. Her family reported her missing after she stopped showing up to work. Each victim had lived in apartment 2B before disappearing. Peter never reported any of them missing. Peter was arrested outside another property he owned just 4 days after the bodies were found. He denied everything, claimed he had no idea how the bodies got there, said maybe a tenant did it, maybe someone else had a key. But detectives weren't buying it. In the crawl space of his personal residence, they found trophies, souvenirs taken from each victim. A bracelet, a photograph, a stained hoodie. DNA evidence linked all 3 victims to Peter's tools and work clothes. The most chilling discovery, however, came from his computer. Hidden in a folder buried under layers of encrypted files was a diary, a digital document titled, "My Rules." In it, Peter detailed grievances against his tenants. He wrote about disrespect, filth, and disobedience. He described punishments. In chilling detail, he wrote about his cleansing process. One entry, dated August 2012, read, "She said she'd call the cops. Nobody calls the cops on me. Nobody tells me what to do in my own building." It was written the same week Rachel Nguyen went missing. Peter Mallory's trial began in June 2014. It was a media circus. Prosecutors painted him as a narcissistic predator who lured vulnerable people into his properties and punished them when they didn't conform to his rules. The defense claimed he was being framed, arguing that transient tenants or even drug dealers could have been responsible. But the jury didn't buy it. With overwhelming forensic evidence, witness testimonies, and the damning diary, Peter was convicted on all counts: 3 counts of first-degree murder, unlawful burial, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The house on Elmridge Street was demolished in 2015. A community garden now sits in its place, with a small plaque bearing the names of the victims. Peter Mallory never confessed. To this day, some believe there may be more victims buried in the foundations of his other properties. Some former tenants recall odd stains, unexplained damage, and even dreams of someone whispering through the vents. No additional bodies have been found yet. But one thing is certain: what happened inside that house wasn't just murder. It was a methodical, calculated campaign of terror carried out by a man hiding in plain sight. A landlord from hell, who buried his secrets just beneath the floorboards.